Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey,
Hey.
Hello, hello, hello. Today we are reviewing The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, the second book in our series Bad Adaptation, where we read good books that were made into bad films. So we'll also be talking about the film. If this is your first time joining us, we are also a literary book club on Reddit. You can join our discussion there by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can also support us and your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link. That's also in the episode description. At our bookshop store page, you can find the books for our book club and other books that we recommend. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will have an in-depth discussion of this book. We hope you'll join us for that episode also. So let's talk about Donna Tartt. This is the second book that we've read of hers. The first one was The Secret History, her debut novel. The book that when we read it for our book club, claimed was a perfect novel. And what I meant by that was technically, I thought it was extremely well written. Donna Tartt is kind of a cultural icon. I guess we can say that, can't we? Is she a cultural icon? Is she famous enough to be a cultural icon?
I mean, at what level? She's no LeBron James.
Definitely in the book world, people know who she is. She's not on the level of J.K. Rowling, maybe. But when she publishes a book, people know about it.
Because she almost never publishes a book. I mean, she's only done it 3 times.
Yeah, like once every 10 years, it seems like.
Yeah.
So when this book was published, it was a big deal. And that was 2013, almost 10 years ago. So I guess she's due for her 4th book soon. When this came out, it was a big deal. It won the Pulitzer. It was the subject of controversy that we will definitely get into this episode because some critics were very much upset and offended that this book won the Pulitzer. And I think, judging by what I know about you guys, I think we might be fairly sympathetic to those ideas.
Well, hold on. I think it's important to say it's not just that she won the Pulitzer, but rather that this is not a great book. And I think it would be a problematic book even if she didn't win the Pulitzer.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
It's not that I have a problem with her winning it. It's this book in particular.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to get into more detail on this later on. As to what this book is about, well, first, it is 700 plus pages, like almost 800 pages, but it's not very complicated. The plot of this book is the main character, Theo Decker, and his mom visit a museum at the beginning of the book. The book is told through retrospective narration, so we actually get this from a more adult Theo who's narrating this story. Theo and his mother visit an art museum, and they are caught in a terrorist attack. The museum is bombed, and his mother dies. He meets an old man as he's making his way out of the museum. The old man urges him to take the painting, the Goldfinch, with him, which he does because he's kind of stunned by the blast. And the old man also tells him to find the old man's partner, Hobie. The two of them run an antiques shop in the village. So this is set in New York. And after Theo makes his way out of the museum, he then goes and meets Hobie. And over time, he becomes Hobie's assistant and eventually Hobie's partner in running the store. So before that happens, though, there is part of the story where he ends up going to Las Vegas because that's where his father is living. His father is separated from them. He doesn't spend a very long time, but he spends perhaps about a year in Las Vegas. He befriends Boris, a Ukrainian, but he's kind of from everywhere. And the two of them spend a year drinking and doing a whole lot of drugs. And then eventually he ends up going back to New York again. There's other characters and other details, but that's pretty much the gist of the first half of the novel. For a time, he also lives with a foster family. And a big part of the story is while at the museum, he does meet the old man's niece, and he develops a crush on her that kind of becomes a lifelong obsession because as he grows up, he ends up running into her again and again, and both of them have to deal with the aftermath of the terrorist attack.
Yeah, for a couple reasons, this could have been part of our obsession series.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I didn't really think about it that way because we did do a series on obsession. So yeah, he is very much obsessed with the painting and this woman.
Strangely, though, not obsessed with the cause of the bomb. Like, he's not too worried, it seems, about why this museum was bombed.
Yeah, I was wondering, early on in the book, if we would get any details via the newspapers that are kind of hidden from us. The foster family that's taking care of him, they hide the newspapers, and I thought it was because they didn't want him to know like who actually bombed the museum, but that turned out to not be the case. It's not really about that at all.
I mean, this is definitely a post 9/11 novel because it treats terrorism so matter of factly. It's not an unusual thing, it's just kind of like a fact of life that sometimes there will be bombings.
I mentioned earlier that this book was panned by some influential critics, but at the same time, it did win the Pulitzer, and it was lauded by a lot of other also influential critics. What did you think about the book?
I felt it was very easy to read, even though it did feel long, and it never lost my interest. It moves along fairly well, and I was interested in the characters. The plot is ridiculous, but it's fun. You're constantly wondering what's going to happen with the painting, with Theo and his other issues that he's got going on. But there's a lot of bad stuff too.
There are always, I think, at least 3 questions or secrets that are unanswered at any point in the book. Like the main one at the beginning is why is he in the Netherlands and why can't he leave the hotel, right? I think that's something that Tartt is really good at, that she is always able to leave something out that makes you want to know more. And I criticize High Rise for employing this kind of tactic, but I actually think it's fine here. I had issues with it in High Rise because I thought that artistically Ballard was going for something different. This was the last book we read for the series. But in this, I thought, well, no. I mean, Donna Tartt is trying to go for a plot driven book. Like, this kind of technique for me is totally fine. I didn't have any issue with her having it at the beginning. This book is so long that it kind of maybe dragged on way longer than it should have until the question was answered. But I didn't have any issue with it being a retrospective narration and it starting where it did.
I think the issue is that with High Rise, we didn't know what Ballard's style would be like, but this is, I think, established now at this point to be her thing. I think that the big flashback is a big thing of her style. We see this with the prologue of The Secret History as well, where we start with the death of Bunny, and as you called it, James, the why done it. So you start with the stinger and you say, what's going on? Why did this happen? And it's effective here because this is such a plot-driven novel. And it is very well done in terms of plot, but that, to me, I think covers up for a lot of the other shortcomings of the novel.
Sam, you said that the plot was, I think you said what, absurd?
Yeah.
And I think that for me, the plot was okay, except there was one secret, one really big reveal that happens, I don't know, like 2/3 through the book that leads to the last third of the book and answers why he's in Amsterdam and all that. I think that secret is not handled well, and also it's hard to believe. But besides that, I didn't really have an issue with the plot. I mean, that's a little bit like, besides that Miss Lincoln, how was the show, right? Like, yeah, I mean, this really big plot twist was unbelievable. But, for an 800-page book, I ended up kind of forgiving her for that.
Sam, let me put words into your mouth. I think when you say it's ridiculous, I think it's ridiculous, but in a good way, right? Like it's exaggerated in an interesting way or a compelling way.
Yeah. There are coincidences that struck me as odd in the book, but I was able to look past them. Even though there are moments where you do have to suspend your disbelief quite a bit, it wasn't really an issue for me.
Right.
I do want to point that out because it does become an issue with the movie, which we'll talk about later.
I think I agree with both of you that the plot is good, but more specifically, I will say that, like James, I think that there are some pretty glaring mistakes or perhaps coincidences that feel a little bit too coincidental. But the aspect of the plot that I think is so well done that makes it, forgivable is momentum. Because we're always moving forward, we don't really need to stop and think about all of these mistakes. But when you stop, that's when the book turns from great into so-so.
I think we should maybe talk about the controversy about this book, which you might also describe as why this book is not so good. I think it's because this book is trying to be passed off as literature with a big L, and really it's not, right? Like, it's just kind of popular fiction. It's kind of like a better written version of what The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo or whatever that book's called, which I did read, or like a much better written version of like a Dan Brown kind of book.
Right.
That's what it is. I think that's the problem that most people have with this book, is that it's being passed off as literature, and maybe it's intended to be literature, but when you finish reading it, it's kind of not literature.
Right. Something that I thought was interesting, I think a lot of my enjoyment of this book, or the lack thereof, and I did enjoy it, but it comes down to the voice. I mean, there are other things going on, but this is all in Theo's voice. And I think if you sympathize with Theo and you like his voice, that will take you a long way. But if you don't like his voice, that's really going to hurt your enjoyment. And I bring that up not just because while I sympathize with him, I thought it was just okay. Comparing this to The Secret History, I thought the character's voice in that book was fantastic. So moving from that to this felt like a letdown.
I don't think there's that much of a difference. I think with Tartt, a lot of people start her novels thinking that it's going to be literature in the way that, James expects with the capital L. But I'm not so sure that it's not really literature, even though a lot of people feel let down. It's literature in the sense that it plays with the same ideas and the same tropes that literature plays with, rather than playing with a murder or playing with a science fiction, sort of an alien invasion. This novel plays with art and authenticity and memory and things like that. And I think the issue in terms of whether or not you would consider this capital L literature is whether or not you think it plays with those things successfully.
I think it might be interesting to go through the three main criticisms of this book from other critics. And I'm using Vanity Fair's article. It's Tart, but is it art? Great title. So the first criticism, and this was from James Wood, who wrote the review in the New Yorker, he said that the tone, language, and story belong in children's literature. And he also said that Tart's message, blared in the book's final pages, is that what will survive of us is great art, but this seems an anxious compensation, as if Tartt were unconsciously acknowledging that the 2013 Goldfinch might not survive the way the 1654 Goldfinch painting has. And Wood, after she won the Pulitzer Prize, told Vanity Fair, quote, "I think that the rapture with which this novel has been received is further proof of infantilization of our literary culture, a world in which adults go around reading Harry Potter." Now, obviously, that sentence is very snobby.
Yeah.
I read Harry Potter many times as an adult, so I have no issues with a world where adults read Harry Potter. But I think his critique is that this is not adult literature, it's children's literature. What do you think about that?
I don't mind it. I don't disagree with him. I know it's very easy to call him a snob. The problem is not that people are reading Harry Potter. The problem is that when they're reading Harry Potter, They don't have time for other things.
Right. This is a book with easy conclusions, the way Harry Potter is a book with easy conclusions. I have not read Harry Potter, but
What?
I know, but I also
God, what a snob.
don't think it's no. I don't think it's a problem. I just haven't read it. That's all.
I mean, given how
Um,
old Sam is, it would be weird if he had read it, because that was a book meant for children when Sam was not a child.
yeah, I am with James on this, that I don't think it's an issue that adults read books like Harry Potter. But I do agree with you also, Ed, if that supplants all other literature in someone's life, then yeah, that is an issue.
I think the important thing here, though, is his claim intimates that children's literature is not real literature. And I don't think he's wrong. I think that what both of you are saying is that children's literature is limited in some way. Like adult literature deals with themes and ideas that children's literature can't really deal with because the target audience is children. So you don't have the same level of complexity.
Right. And I think Ed is right that this book attempts those things, but falls a little short.
I think that it's a valid criticism, but I think that it's a difference in degree rather than a difference in kind. This book tries for something that serious literature tries for, and it fails to achieve it, but lots of other adult novels also fail in the same way. So it's not really special, it's just another novel that isn't particularly good thematically.
So, in the second critique cited by this Vanity Fair article, you have novelist and critic Francine Prose, and I think she also is pretty well known for writing a craft book. She wrote that this book is frequently described as Dickensian, but Tartt demonstrates little of Dickens's remarkable powers of description and graceful language. She criticizes Tartt for using lazy cliches. She cites Theo's high school friend Tom's cigarette is only the tip of the iceberg. The bomb site is a madhouse. So those are passages that she takes issue with. She thought the passages were bombastic, overwritten, marred by baffling turns of phrase. And Prose said she found herself wondering, does anyone care how something is written anymore? Now, I thought that this was off base. I didn't agree with Prose here in that she's critiquing the prose, but I didn't think the prose was that bad. I know, like, she certainly did cite passages that were, like very cliched, but in the 800-page book, you can kind of get away with an odd, awkward phrase.
Well, this is sort of what I was getting at when I compared it to The Secret History. The characters are very different in that book and this one, but I think because the voice is this very literary, philosophical voice in The Secret History, at least from what I remember, we don't get a lot of those cliches. We get a lot more introspection that feels earned, I guess, and not overwrought. But here, it felt right for his voice, but I don't know that his voice is interesting enough to forgive those cliches and things like that. And you're right, it is 800 pages, so maybe we have to be a little forgiving. But I don't really know that we do,
I
honestly.
don't think it matters that it's 800 pages. I think the reason why she can say this and be right and wrong at the same time is because she's reviewing a book, and when you review a book, you have to stop and think and look. But this is not a book for stopping and looking. This is a book for moving forward. And when you're moving forward, the pleasure of the story is always what will happen next. There's always something you don't know about. And as long as you don't try for any kind of close reading, you're fine, because you always want to know what happens next. So that really is the magic bullet that makes any other criticism of the novel almost invalid in terms of making something that a reader can love and enjoy. This is a book that I read and I loved and enjoyed it, and only when I read Prose's review do I actually notice all of these problems.
Yeah, I'll say that I didn't notice the things that she pointed out, but at the same time, I didn't love the prose. I felt that it mostly was moving me forward.
One thing that she didn't bring up, but I think is worth noting, because this is something that I did actually notice when I was reading, is Boris. The characterization of Boris was a caricature. And this is not a subtle book necessarily, but I did not enjoy him as a character. I thought that the way he was drawn as this kind of wild Eastern European kind of vagabond, it was just a little bit too much for me. Everything else was forgivable, but he was a little bit too much.
That's interesting, because I did feel like he was a complete caricature, but I also enjoyed him as a character. So I didn't have a problem with Boris. However, I did read a review, not by anyone of consequence, just some blog.
Poor
But
blogger. Just like,
yeah, I'll look it up and give credit where credit is
yeah,
due. But
you're gonna link it. You're gonna link this blog. That guy's gonna see like, hey,
okay,
there's like more people coming here to read this article. He's gonna listen to our podcast and get to this part. He's gonna be like, oh shucks.
Okay, so what I mean is, I think it was a woman. This woman isn't like a New Yorker reviewer or anything.
I think it was a
That's
woman.
what I mean. No, fuck off. Anyway, her review was mostly about how racist this book was. And she went through pains to outline all these different issues. And she has sort of a point. There are things that she took a little too seriously and things that she probably took the right level of seriousness. But I forgave a lot of that because, again, this is Theo's voice. And Theo sounds like the kind of person who might judge a person by their background.
I'll put it to you this way. Boris represents Ukrainians about as well as Apu on The Simpsons represents Indians.
Well, that's fair, yeah.
Which is fine if this were The Simpsons, but it's not trying to be The Simpsons. So it's...
Well, what did you think about the barbers? Because I thought they were kind of a caricature. There's nothing new there at all with the barbers. The alcoholism, even the bullying and the sailing, like it's all kind of cliche.
Yeah.
They're stock characters, but I think inside of every stock character, inside of every kind of well-worn phrase, there's a grain of truth. And again, I keep harping on momentum. Because the momentum is there, that grain of truth is enough. You see these characters and you feel like, oh, well, that's something from life, or at least something from another novel that I've already read, so it feels authentic.
So what's the grain of truth here with Boris?
I think the grain of truth is that there are people who have these wrecked childhoods where their parents are shuffling them around the world, and it prevents them from growing in the typical way where they have community and a family that kind of nurtures them, and it pushes them towards antisocial or criminal behaviors, which, it's not everybody. It's not everybody from that country or that ethnicity or whatever, but it does happen.
The third main critic, not some random blogger, but an actual important person, was Lauren Stein, editor of the Paris Review, probably the snobbiest of the snobs. He says, the book coats everything in a cozy patina of literary gentility. He says that, who cares that Kakutani or King gave it the stamp of approval? Even the New York Times Book Review is afraid to say when a popular book is crap. So he's saying that it is actually crap, but there's so much momentum behind the book that people are saying it's not crap. That everyone is saying this book is really good, and that kind of gives it that coding that allows people to accept it as literature, when in fact it's not literature.
I think most readers don't care what professional critics have to say. If they have heard from their friend that this is good, they're going to read it, and it doesn't matter if Lauren Stein doesn't like it. It doesn't matter if James Wood doesn't like it. So I don't think that there is this kind of inertia against the novel that Stein imagines has suddenly been overcome, because I don't think that inertia ever really existed.
Hmm. I think Kakutani has a lot of sway. I think people actually do read the New York Times book review for opinions.
I think as long as they can have one flattering word to put on the dust jacket, that's enough. I think people read dust jackets more than they read the New York Times book reviews. She does have some sway, and she was one of the serious reviewers who liked this novel. I read her review, it was okay. I also read Stephen King's review, and it didn't matter to me that Stephen King liked it because I don't really respect Stephen King's opinion. So it's kind of irrelevant to have him review a book.
So, to sort of summarize where we are, I think we more or less agree with each other, right? I mean, maybe we have slightly differing opinions on, what we didn't like about this book, but we all thought it was like a good read. But the problem was there's just not much on the idea level. And Tart, at the end of the book, tries to kind of dump ideas onto you, but it's not enough. The book itself, in its 800 pages, is not suffused with ideas. It's not really engaging with the reader on that level.
Right. There are threads that she's put throughout the novel, but they're not, I would say, substantial threads. And so when she pulls on those strings at the end of the novel, it feels, to mix metaphors, like she's shoehorning it in.
So let me ask you something. This is something I was pondering. We also critiqued Station 11 for, I think, a similar reason. That book was either a finalist or it won the National Book Award. That book's main point was that art is important, right? Art is what
Yeah.
survives us. Like, is this book the same? Isn't it making the same point in the same kind of awkward manner?
I would say no. I think the reason why is that Tart's sensibility is more attractive to me than Emily St. John Mandel. I think when Mandel wrote that novel, it was more of a young adult vibe. And thematically, this novel is pretty much as hollow as that novel was, but the sensibility and the vibe is more mature. So this appeals to me more, even if that's a shallow reason for liking this book more.
No, I agree. It feels more adult. Both the approach to it and I guess, the structuring of it feels more adult here.
Also, just in terms of the craft, this momentum that I keep talking about, this book is really, really well plotted. I was happy to read all 800 pages. I didn't feel like it was overlong. Looking back, if I focus, I can see all of these problems, but in terms of enjoyment, I am for sure a fan of this book. In terms of
Yeah,
enjoyment,
as
I did not like Station 11 that much, and there were many more times when I was rolling my eyes than with this book, even looking backwards at this book.
right. As I don't remember which reviewer said it. I come through a bunch of reviews for this one. But someone pointed out that this book is all story. The plot really carries it all the way through, and I think you could do a lot worse with books that are focused just on plot.
All right, let's take a break. And when we come back, we will talk about the film adaptation that was actually much, much worse. We'll be right back. Welcome back. All right, let's talk about the film. The film was made in 2019. It had um, quite a lot of publicity, if I remember correctly, at the time. And you had Nicole Kidman. I think she was the biggest name attached to the film. But the film was a dud, and all three of us watched the film, and I think we all agree that it was a dud, right?
Yes.
Yes.
My biggest issue with it was the pacing was way off. Like, we never got any time at the beginning of the movie to settle in, understand the characters, really identify with the characters, really feel for Theo, which you get in the book because it's first person retrospective. So you're embodying the voice, right, as you read. Um, in the movie, you just don't get that. And I mean, that's like, I would say probably the most important part of the movie because that's what the book is. Like, you have to be with Theo and
Right.
you have to understand his obsession with the painting. And that is not handled well in the film, so the film just doesn't work for me.
Yeah. This is also subjective, especially since I saw that some people really did like the acting, but I really disliked most of the acting throughout the movie, especially, unfortunately, with the kid that plays young Theo.
Oh, with the punchable
Um,
face.
It was just flat, right? Like,
yeah.
you didn't really care about them either way.
Yeah, I didn't like the acting, but to your point, James, it wouldn't have bothered me as much if it didn't feel so jumbled. The time jumps that don't happen in the book, um, except for going back in time from the very beginning of the book. The movie jumps all over the place, so we don't get that firm understanding of the character the way you're talking about.
I will say that I didn't really have a lot of problems with the performances in this film. This film has a lot going for it in terms of the names of people attached to it. It's got Nicole Kidman,
Sure.
Jeffrey Wright, Luke Wilson, even the kid from Stranger Things, Finn Wolfhard, which is definitely a porn star name. It's got cinematography by Roger Deakins. It's got like as much clout as a film could have. The problem with this film is 100% the storytelling, which is the biggest thing to fuck up on because this novel that they're trying to adapt, 100% of the good things in the novel are the storytelling, right? So they
Yeah.
fucked up the most important thing. This is not a novel for looking backwards and for moving from point to point because each point is empty. What the movie fucks up is they don't move forward in a line and let the momentum carry the story forward. They go through these flash forwards and flashbacks and they connect things, trying to make them resonant with each other, but they have no resonance. It loses all of the intrigue and it just feels like a very rushed film, which is actually like 150 minutes long.
And all of my negative points really do tie back to that. The plot and order changes are the biggest thing. The other problems I have still stem back to that. Like, there's an epiphany that Theo has that is very important, but it's robbed from him in the movie. It's kind of handed to him. So it's not his.
Right.
There are coincidences, as I mentioned, in the book, but they're forgivable. We don't spend a lot of time on the fact that they are coincidences. In the movie, they are very strongly broadcast, so you have no choice but to stare it in the face. And by jumping around, we don't get the weight of these moments. We don't have this forward moving momentum that the book has. And that's from right at the beginning with the museum attack. I understand why the director tried to do that, tried to put the museum attack in the middle of the movie, but it works in the book as the beginning. It works as this impetus that drives the entire story forward. And we don't get that. It doesn't feel like there's much importance in the movie, or not nearly as much importance as there should be.
Another thing I think is worth talking about just in terms of adaptation, this film is like 150 minutes long and it needs more because if you have read the novel, you know that there's a lot missing. And if you haven't read the novel, there's a lot that doesn't make sense. What I'm wondering, though, is this an adaptation that's made as kind of fan service for people who know and love the novel, or is this meant to be a standalone work? Because if it is not a standalone work, then it would be a little bit more forgivable if we just entered into the film with the tacit assumption that everybody already knows the story because they read the novel. I could forgive a few more things than I could otherwise.
I would expect this to be meant to stand alone.
I think that's my expectation, but after having watched the film, it feels like fan service.
Right.
I agree with you, Yed, that I think it doesn't cover enough of the book. I think part of the problem is though is that it kind of got caught in the in-between space where you have to decide, right, when you're making an adaptation, what you will be faithful to and what you won't be. And I think in some ways it's faithful to too much. Like you can't cover the whole 800 pages in 3 hours, right? Like you just can't. So you have to figure out what you're going to focus on. What I probably would have focused on, and it doesn't mean it's the right answer, but what I think are important are Theo, the painting The Goldfinch, which got very little attention in the film, and his lady love, Pippa. It's like in the movie, you don't really get why the painting's so important. You don't see him agonizing over where the painting is, or being afraid that he might lose the painting as he's moving from one place to another. That's really important in my reading of the book.
That's true, but you know what else is also important is all of the things that happen in Amsterdam. Like the initial encounter when they're trying to get the painting, it's just really, really sketchy. And we don't really know what's going on. And if I hadn't read the novel first, that would have been a huge problem for me, just in terms of understanding the mechanics of the scene. Like, that needed to be developed more. And I agree that these other things you mentioned also need to be developed, but that is definitely a problem. And if you just go through and try to figure out what could be developed, I think you start ending up at like a 6-hour film, which makes me think, because this is such a plot-driven thing, if it were a miniseries, that would solve a lot of this, right? Like if it were done in like 6-hour-long episodes, I think it could be done well.
Yeah. If you're trying to do it in the format of a film, you really just have to pick and choose and decide what is important. And I don't think you can be faithful to the book.
I feel like we're coming down on the decision that most books, most novels should just be turned into miniseries.
I think that it doesn't hurt to have more time. For most of the time when you're adapting something, you usually have not enough time rather than too much time. So I think that's why I tend towards recommending a miniseries. With this especially because the book is so long, and in my reading at least, it didn't feel overlong. There's so much in there that I would like to keep that I don't really know how I would cut it. Like, I think his attachment to Pippa is important, but I think that the work that happens in Amsterdam is also really important. How could I choose?
I think that all the best adaptations, and we'll probably get into this a bit more in our wrap up episode a few weeks from now. I think all the best adaptations in my mind are not overly faithful to the book. You have to choose. You cannot cover everything. You might have to leave out something important in the service of telling a story that is even more important. So for me, the story is it's Theo, his obsession, his need for the painting, which represents his mother, and ditto Pippa. He's got a strand connecting him to the painting and a strand connecting him to Pippa. Both Pippa and the painting represent something in his life that is not there. That is the story. Throughout the book, he has that absence in his life and he's trying to fill it. It's the painting and it's the girl. If you don't have that, then you're missing the point of the book, in my mind. Everything else, for me, should be in service to that.
I think to offer an adaptation that is wildly inventive just 5 years after the release of the novel would be a little bit awkward. I would be really intrigued by it but I would not expect it from Hollywood. I would not expect a studio to spend a lot of money doing something so risky. Here I'm thinking of like Akira Kurosawa's adaptation of Macbeth, Throne of Blood. Like that is very radically different, and it's different in a very artistically stimulating way. But that is centuries after the fact. Like 5 years after the fact, I think most creators are going to tend towards faithfulness rather than invention.
All right, so before we wrap up, let's talk about who we would recommend this book to. Or would you recommend this book? I'm guessing no one would recommend the film. Like, there's no point in watching the film.
No, I actively disliked the movie, but I did enjoy the book. I don't know if I loved it as much as maybe either of you, I'm not sure, but I did thoroughly enjoy it. It does, as we've talked about, have a certain momentum that carries you through. So I don't know that there were any moments where I felt bored. Even though it did feel long, it's not boring at any point. It's very engrossing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it's an enjoyable book to read, and it doesn't make me roll my eyes in the way that a lot of books do. So, to that end, I would say that this is a great book for people who don't read much but would like to start reading more. And it's a very one size fits all kind of thing because it doesn't have anything too intellectual that would alienate a reader. It doesn't have anything too artsy fartsy that would alienate a reader. This is the kind of thing that you could give everybody, like you'd give everybody a tuna sandwich.
Wow, that's a. I don't know if you could give everyone a tuna sandwich, but you could certainly give anyone this book.
Yeah, it's kind of like a. I'm not going to go with a tuna sandwich simile. But for me, it's more like an armchair, just like a comfy old armchair. Anyone can enjoy sitting in an armchair. It kind of just holds you as you read, you're just with the book. I think a part of the appeal is the kind of lushness in the setting and this description of almost like an alternate world where yeah there are terrorist attacks and yeah like homes are being foreclosed, but you're living in this world of art and artsiness and old things and warmth. You just feel like you're walking into a world that's very warm despite all the problems that are happening. All right, let's stop here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with this review of The Goldfinch, you can come and let us know on Reddit. You can find that link below. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with an in-depth discussion of this novel and film. If you're interested in joining our discussion on the Goldfinch, go ahead and find a copy of this book. Once again, it is very, very long, so you'll have to budget quite a lot of time. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.